with you.
Yeah.
Because it's a party language. So. Okay, we'll run a test here. That sounds pretty good. Okay. This should be overcome the conversations going on in the back here.
Okay. Let's see. Try to speak it here. Okay.
I think he's going to introduce.
I'll hold on.
Yeah, I saw that.
And she was working and
Okay, as we continue on with our program for this afternoon, Dr. Guimont is going to present us with his book relative to H.P. Lovecraft. And if I'm faltering a little bit, it's because I think I'm the only one here who hasn't read H.P. Lovecraft. Oh, okay, I'm going to sit over here. That was especially true at lunch. So with that, let's please extend a warm skyscraper welcome to Dr. Guimont.
All right, hello, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I've been meaning to come visit the observatory for a while, so this is a good excuse to actually make it over here. So, yeah, my name's Eddie Guimont. I'm an associate professor of world history over at Bristol Community College in Fall River, Massachusetts, so it's not too far away. I actually did my graduate work at UConn, so the earlier presentation on the East Road Observatory was very interesting for that, also especially since I had no idea that was even there while I was at UConn. But this book, I co-wrote it with Horace Smith, who's an astronomer now at Michigan State University, but like me, he's actually from Connecticut, and so.
My bad.
Oh.
Sorry.
There we go. So he was actually also from Connecticut. We actually got together initially because we both had an interest in kind of Lovecraft's activities in Connecticut, and then we were both kind of working on parallel book ideas. We kind of blended them together, and the end result was this. And again, I think I'm kind of unique here. I'm not an astronomer or a physicist or an engineer or anything like that. I am a historian. So this book was a historian and an astronomer working together to write something that was both kind of like a biographical book and a history of science and kind of a literature review. So it is a very interdisciplinary work. But as mentioned, I have 5 copies left. If anyone wants any, happy to sell them at a discount. I'll just advertise that. But I'll bring it up at the end again, so don't worry. So again, I can't really go over everything in the book. I'm going to try and pick some of the more interesting points to cover. But if anyone has any questions on anything else, I'll try to answer it best I can at the end. But it seems like most of us are familiar with Lovecraft. For those who aren't, Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, he was born in August 20th, 1890 in Providence. He died March 15th, 1937 in Providence. He lived in Providence most of his life. He had a couple of years where he lived in Brooklyn, but moved back to Providence. So again, very much a Rhode Island based author. He was a pioneer of a type of fiction called cosmic horror, or weird fiction as he called it, which is, probably easiest to refer to as kind of like a blending of science fiction and horror and fantasy. And, for example, Stephen King was very influenced by Lovecraft, Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, Guillermo del Toro. So someone who became very influential after he died. During his life, almost entirely unknown. His biggest kind of exposure on a national stage was when he died. He left a kind of like a notebook about his symptoms before he died, and the fact that he kept that notebook of symptoms before his death was published in the New York Times. So literally, his death was the most notable thing that happened during his lifetime. But afterwards, a number of his friends kind of like decided they didn't want his work to die. They didn't want his work to die, so they created a publishing house to keep his stories alive. And kind of starting in the 60s, there was a big revival, and it got bigger in the 70s and 80s, and especially the 90s. So again, someone whose influence has really expanded throughout. His kind of most famous stories, The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, which you see here, The Shadow Out of Time, The Shadow over Innsmouth. Again, probably some of the better well-known ones there. Probably Herbert West Reanimator, since it became the basis for the 1980s movies, although he actually thought that was one of his worst stories. So he probably would be surprised that that became the big movie adaptation so far. But I'll mention a few of his specific stories, but try to kind of give context with them. And again, kind of like the big series of stories, although he did not consider it a series during his lifetime, but once he died, his friends kind of, grouped them together into what was called the Cthulhu mythos, after one of his kind of central alien deities in the story. So his works kind of became known as the Cthulhu mythos, even though, again, it's one of the things that he did not come up with that term. It was invented after he died, but a sign of how his influence kind of expanded only after he left this world. But although he's best known for his fiction writing now, he had from a very young age an early interest in astronomy. He was very interested in science, but to him, science essentially was astronomy. Hippocampus Press, which published my book, they have a collection of Lovecraft science writings. Almost the entire book is his work on astronomy, and most of his astronomy writing was from when he was young, mainly a teenager, early 20s. He really wanted to become an astronomer, but he was terrible at math, and that kind of dissuaded him. Also, he never ended up graduating from high school, so he had very little formal education. I mean, he basically had, I think it was 2 or 3 years of high school, and that was the limit of his formal education. But he was extremely self-educated. He was a prodigious reader, and he communicated with a number of scientific minds in Providence and elsewhere. So great was his interest in astronomy. He claimed in one of his early letters to one of his friends that his interest in astronomy is one of the things that prevented him from committing suicide, because he was just so interested in astronomical discoveries that is happening in his lifetime. And as a young teenager, he self-publishes his own astronomical journal. He calls it the Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy. He publishes it from 1903 to 1907, and one more issue a couple years later. Typically, it was weekly and then monthly. So he's writing this huge output of like an amateur astronomy journal. It's not really sure who is reading this. It's not really sure who's he's selling it to. Probably just his family members and neighbors. But he's at least putting this out, and it really covers a lot of his personal astronomy he's doing with his own telescope. And then starting from 1906, he wrote astronomy columns for 2 local newspapers, the Patuxent Valley Gleaner and the Providence Tribune. And these articles, again, are essentially, for the most part, recycling the stuff he's writing in his personal astronomy journal. So he does have this early professional output. Some of the very first things he's professionally publishing are his astronomy columns. And actually, I think maybe even the first thing that gets published by him is a letter to the editor of, I think it was Scientific American, about the search for, what we now call Pluto, was Planet X at the time. So again, he is interested enough in astronomy to get these regional and in some cases national publications, even if just in letter form. Then from his early newspapers, from 1913 through 1918, he started writing larger astronomy columns for both the Providence Evening News and then also, interestingly, the Asheville Gazette News. And it's kind of unknown how some guy who had never left Rhode Island at the time was writing for a North Carolina newspaper. He had a childhood friend, Chester Monroe, who moved to Asheville from Providence, so that's probably the connection. Although again, not really 100% certain why that is. in addition to kind of just writing about general astronomy topics, he was also very interested in debunking misconceptions about astronomy, maybe we can say. In particular, he got into this long-running back and forth with an astrologer that was publishing astrology columns. To the and Lovecraft then starts, pretending to be an astrologer and making these outlandish claims about how he can predict, in the year 4596 that the Earth is going to be destroyed, but a chunk of providence will land on Venus and Venus will become colonized. But claiming this is an astrological claim, and the guy who's having this debate doesn't really know how to respond to that, since this is astrological science. And so again, there's this perception that you see this photograph of Lovecraft, he's very dour. There's this sense that he was this very serious guy, but he did have a very strong sense of humor. Also, just came out in certain ways. He also was very prominent debunking hollow Earth theories, which was kind of popular at the time. And as I'll mention later on, there's another kind of a brief wave of astronomical pseudoscience that he gets involved in attempting to debunk. But in addition to kind of this early nonfiction, he's writing very early on bits of science fiction, essentially. One of his articles in his journals in 1903 is titled, "Can the Moon Be Reached by Man?" This was a notable foray into kind of early space flight speculation, which was inspired by an article in the Muncie magazine in that month by Ernest Green Dodge titled, "Can Men Visit the Moon?" As a young boy, Lovecraft was very interested in science fiction specifically, particularly Jules Verne. And again, you can see, this early publication of From the Earth to the Moon, his illustration of a lunar train reaching the moon, which seems like, it's based on this Verne publication. Again, one of his arguments is that one of the benefits of reaching the moon is to make a lunar observatory, and you can see his sketch of what an observatory on the moon would look like. So again, space astronomy, writing about it in 1903, that's fairly prophetic, from there. He did read H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, not until later on, but he did read Wells's The First Men in the Moon very early, as well as an early science fiction novel by John Jacob Astor from 1894 called A Journey in Other Worlds, again, an early space opera. There's a well-known science or astronomy popularizer at the time, Garrett Serviss, who also wrote some science fiction we'll talk about in a bit. Lovecraft says he read everything by Garrett Serviss. So again, an early astronomy writer. We know he read a lot of them. We know also that Lovecraft owned quite a lot of his books. S.T. Joshi is kind of the leading Lovecraft scholar. He's published a book of all the known books that Lovecraft owned. And so we do know explicitly which astronomy books he had on hand. And most of the astronomy books he had on hand are from the 19th century. Again, Lovecraft was kind of, very interested in kind of the scientific developments up until the end of the 19th century. He's very interested in Einstein's later work, but is kind of unable to move beyond the concept of the ether. He's kind of really solidified on the notion of ether instead of relativity. And kind of interesting, at the very end of his life, Lovecraft says, well, maybe Einstein was wrong in general. So it is interesting that someone who was interested in kind of debunking some of this astronomical pseudoscience, if he had hypothetically lived longer, and he died very unexpectedly, very suddenly from intestinal cancer. So there is this big, semi-genre, what if Lovecraft had lived longer? So, he might have kind of delved a bit back into the pseudoscience aspect. But outside of kind of this early science fiction, Lovecraft did have one very early point of access to pure astronomical knowledge. Of course, Ladd Observatory at Brown University. Growing up, Lovecraft was, he lived only a few blocks away from Ladd here. I found this photograph of Ladd in the astronomy department archives at the John Hay Library at Brown. Michael Umbricht was, he helped set me up to get access to that. This is actually Ladd Observatory at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898. So that's interesting. I don't know why they took a picture of that, but that's what the archive said. So LAD, as I'm sure many people here know, its construction is funded in 1889 by the Rhode Island governor, Herbert Ladd. It's opened in 1891. So again, it has its own birth almost exactly with Lovecraft's birth also. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with LAD, so I won't go into a lot of the specifics, but LAD functioned not just as an observatory, but also as a meteorological station and as a classroom for Brown University when it was opened. And here we have the LAD library. This is a photograph of what the observatory library looked like from, it's circa 1891 to 98. And again, it hasn't changed hugely since then. I think, last time I was there, I think the Saturn painting was still there.
Still there.
But, yeah, so, and again, hasn't changed. As a teenager, Lovecraft visited LAD Observatory. He writes a lot about spending time in the LAD library. He writes about, taking books out. I'm very proud of this. One of the things that was kind of unknown was what exactly Lovecraft was reading in the LAD library. And the Lovecraft field, is such that anything to do with the Lovecraft as a whole, like archive at the Brown Library at the John Hay, that's been picked over by Lovecraft scholars. But I was able to go through the Department of Astronomy records at the John Hay, which for somehow no Lovecraft person has looked over yet. So I was able to find the library log from the LAD library, and I was able to find what Lovecraft was taking out. And so we know that from October 27th to November 24th, 1906, he took out Robert Wheeler Wilson's 1905 Laboratory Astronomy. From January 11th to June 11th, 1907, Lovecraft took out a book called How to Work with the Spectroscope, which, not 100% clear what book that was, probably John Browning's 1878 text. So again, we know that. And interestingly, from June 11th to July 25th, 1907, he took out a book called The Planet Mars by William Henry Pickering. Pickering, as far as I can tell, never wrote a book called The Planet Mars. So again, I'm not exactly sure what book Lovecraft took out. I think it was Pickering's translation of a series of articles from 1894 by Giovanni Schiaparelli. So I think that's what this book was. Again, Schiaparelli, the discoverer of the Martian Canal Leak, which I'll talk, I'm sure we all are familiar with. I'll talk a little bit about later on and its impact on Lovecraft's later fiction, but it makes sense also, especially that time period in 1907, because a certain other astronomical figure was visiting Brown at that time. But you can also wonder, why would Lovecraft, this teenager without even a high school education at this point, why is he being allowed into Brown's LAD observatory, let alone being able to take out books from the LAD library? That probably has to do with the first director of LAD, Winslow Upton, see here. Upton seems to have been a friend of Franklin Chase Clark, who was the husband of Lovecraft's Aunt Lillian. So this is probably how young Lovecraft had that connection to Upton. And Upton also, he wrote the astronomy column for what was then and still is the main Rhode Island newspaper, the Providence Journal. This is probably also how Lovecraft got the connection to write for, not the Providence Journal, because he couldn't compete with Upton, but for those lesser Rhode Island newspapers. So Upton seems like this kind of a early force, not only in Lovecraft's scientific education, but the beginning of his professional writing career. So, very different from his later writing career. And of course, if you go see LAD Observatory today, you go directly east of LAD Observatory, and there's Upton Avenue there. So his memory is right there. Also, other nearby streets in Providence, Planet Street, Transit Street. In 1769, Venus. Now, there's a very famous transit of Venus that's observed by a local self-taught mathematician, Benjamin West. He observes the transit using what is believed to be the first recorded telescope in Providence. And maybe there were others, but this is the first time a telescope in Providence is being written about. He wrote a pamphlet on this observation of the transit of Venus because of how highly regarded astronomy was at the time. West was given an honorary doctorate by Brown, became a mathematics and astronomy professor. West Telescope, is still there. The transit of Venus also notably was so popular that it helped contribute to Providence eclipsing, so to speak, Newport as the major city of Rhode Island. Planet Street also runs parallel to Angel Street where Lovecraft lived. So again, Lovecraft no doubt walked up and down these streets many times. Benjamin West himself, he is a minor character, and his pamphlet is also mentioned in Lovecraft's longest novel, but again, not published till after his death, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward.
Yep.
So again, this early astronomical figure of Providence history is there, and but I think a lot of people would say it's probably Lovecraft's best novel. And of course, Lovecraft, we have Dr. Benjamin West. Lovecraft would later write about a Dr. Herbert West. Again, not probably a coincidence, but who knows also. It's possible that there was some overlap there. But also, at the same time, in that early group of astronomers under Upton at the Ladd Observatory, another Frederick Slocum, you see here. Slocum, again, was one of the astronomers that Lovecraft wrote specifically about, helping him learn about astronomy, showing him around the observatory. Again, also in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, there's a minor character named Charles Slocum. Maybe it's named after Frederick, although it's also possible this was named after Joshua Slocum, who was a sailor who was the first person to circumnavigate the world in his personal yacht. Interestingly, Joshua Slocum left on his trip around the world from Fairhaven, Massachusetts, which is also where Frederick Slocum lived, although there's definitely no family connection because Joshua was an immigrant. So again, an interesting parallel there. I will say the sailor Joshua, in his sailing around the world, when he lands in South Africa, he gets into a fist fight with a number of flat earthers who are angry at him, claiming he was sailing around the world. I'll take this opportunity to say I'm finishing up a book on the history of the flat earth movement, and Slocum's legacy is big there. Happy to talk about that later. Maybe I'll, not really any Rhode Island connection, but I can always come and talk about that in the future. But Frederick Slocum, he leaves Ladd Observatory to set up the Van Vleck Observatory at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. The third astronomer at Ladd, whom Lovecraft also knew and wrote about, although he kind of wrote about this guy the least, was John William Edwards. Edwards also later left Ladd to work at Van Vleck with Slocum. The Van Vleck Observatory at Wesleyan, this is also where my co-author Horace, he worked there also in his time at Wesleyan. So this was, I think, one of his early entry points into learning about Lovecraft and astronomy. One of the interesting kind of parallels in Middletown, the Van Vleck Observatory, this is about a mile, almost directly a mile down the street from the Episcopal Church in Middletown. Lovecraft had a very good friend, and occasionally they collaborated on writing fiction together, Henry S. Whitehead. Whitehead was an Episcopal priest. He was rector of that Episcopal church in Middletown the exact same time that the two astronomers that Lovecraft knew were at Van Vleck. But again, it seems to be a total coincidence. There doesn't seem that either of them kind of realized that, that doesn't even seem like their paths may have crossed, let alone that Lovecraft kind of put together that, these two different parts of his life intersected. But again, kind of an interesting coincidence that, Middletown and Wesleyan had both of these Lovecraftian connection. As far as I can tell, Lovecraft never did go to Middletown to see either of the observatory or the church. The last kind of thing about Ladd I'll bring up is there are these pieces of technology. I think these are stabilizing things, I believe, for the clock. I don't quite know. Michael Umbrick showed me these. He meant, I forget off the top of my head. But in his novella, I guess, The Whisperer in Darkness, which has another major astronomy connection I'll mention later on. These are about aliens who live on the planet Yuggoth and called the Migo, and they come to Earth and they can take people's brains out and put them into giant metal cylinders to travel through space to bring them to another planet. So it is kind of the curious, if Lovecraft saw these things at Ladd and they stuck in his mind, and later on they showed up in The Whisperer in Darkness. And maybe, maybe not. Now I mentioned Lovecraft may have taken the book of what seemed to be the translation by Schiaparelli, the Italian astronomer. He took those out in early 1907. That's because a certain person was coming to speak at Brown University then. And this was Percival Lowell, again infamous for taking Schiaparelli's musings of the Martian Canali, turning them into the Martian Canals. Again, highlighting the idea that Mars was inhabited by this, hyper-intelligent race of ancient beings who are, reworking the surface of their planet to save the ecology, as the planet's slowly drying up. I'm sure we're all at least, broadly familiar with this. On January 7th, 1907, Percival Lowell came to Brown University. He gave a talk at Sales Hall there titled Proofs of Life on Mars. Lovecraft not only attended that lecture, but afterwards Upton introduced Lovecraft to Percival Lowell, and the two, Lovecraft was 17, so I guess kind of a man, but the two guys had a conversation afterwards. So Lovecraft did directly meet Lowell. Lovecraft, at the time, he was a firm believer in Lowell's ideas about Martian canals. Later on in his letters, Lovecraft would tell people oh, I met Lowell once, but I never seriously, believed any of his theories about Martians. But he very much, if you read his letters, if you read his astronomy journals, at least for a time, he was totally convinced about this. Near the end of his life, again, he became much more skeptical, though even at the very end, he was writing to some people, and he said he did believe that there was simple vegetation on Mars, which kind of is in line with the theories by the 1930s. But it's also interesting because you have in Percival Lowell the idea that these ancient beings on another planet who are dying off, futilely trying to change the environment to survive against, but eventually time is going to inevitably cause their extinction. These are themes that are very prevalent in Lovecraft's fiction as well, with his notion of the insignificance of people in the cosmos, the power of the natural world to overwhelm the individual. So again, it is kind of interesting to think that Lowell's conception of Mars as a dying planet, his specific views of the Martians, did kind of shape Lovecraft's views of cosmic horror and this cosmic mindset. Of course, another person who was influenced by Percival Lowell was H.G. Wells. Again, H.G. Wells writes The War of the Worlds. He serializes it in 1897, comes out in collected form in 1898. Wells's Martians. Again, Wells doesn't mention the canals in his novel, but the general idea of Mars as popularized by Lowell is in Wells's story. But Wells, has these cephalopod-like Martians. These are from the original Goebel illustration on the left of The War of the Worlds. I did flip it upside down, but Wells's Martians are explicitly cephalopod, in appearance. They're depicted, or he famously in the opening says that these are intelligences, vast and cool and unsympathetic, that there is, their relation to humans is like humans' relationships to bugs. And so Lovecraft, one of his best known stories, The Call of Cthulhu, which he writes in 1926, I believe. The kind of the great deity of Lovecraft's work, Cthulhu, is again this alien who comes to Earth, is kind of has a cephalopod nature, has tentacles. He's described almost exactly the same, as being not evil, but just kind of beyond consideration of humans, because humans are so insignificant to him. Notably, also in The War of the Worlds, there's a scene in which a British dreadnought rams one of the Martian tripods. The climax of The Call of Cthulhu is a fishing ship rams Cthulhu, which is in the ocean. So you have these interesting parallels in which H.G. Wells's Martians seemingly influence at least this one particular notable entity from Lovecraft's fiction. It's also interesting that this seems to have been very evocative for Lovecraft. In 1920, he writes to one of his friends, Reinhard Kleiner, about this dream. Like Lovecraft always said he had very vivid dreams, and a lot of his ideas came from his dreams. He talked about having a dream about this like meteor hitting Providence, some kind of like force coming out of the meteor and destroying the Congregational Church dome in Providence. And so this is almost exactly the same as some of the imagery when the Martians attack London in the War of the Worlds. So it seems like Lovecraft is getting this nightmare fuel from reading H.G. Wells, or at least parts of H.G. Wells. Now, Lovecraft also not the only person who is influenced by H.G. Wells. Garrett Serviss, also the science popularizer, was influenced. Again, this is 1898. This is a time in which copyright law is somewhat more loosely interpreted than it is today, which means the War of the Worlds was such a huge hit that a number of U.S. newspapers almost immediately rushed to basically, make illegal sequels in quotes, and that basically they would take the War of the Worlds, change London for New York or Boston, and republish it as like the War of the Worlds in Boston or the War of the Worlds in New York. And so you had these unauthorized reprints that were basically name changes, but technically sequels, they claimed. Then one of the newspapers hires Garrett Serviss, again, who's very well known as a science popularizer, but did write occasional fiction. They hire him to write a direct sequel called Edison's Conquest of Mars, which is exactly what it sounds like, where after the events of the War of the Worlds, Thomas Edison is hired by the U.S. government to build these space battleships and go to Mars. And they go to Mars and they commit genocide against the Martians. It ends with the U.S. building this fleet and wiping out the Martians. But this is actually it's a very cheaply made story, and it's not good quality. But it is interesting that this is in 1898. This is a pioneering work of science fiction that it's seemingly the first appearance of spacesuits in science fiction, ray guns, the first appearance of interplanetary battle between fleets of spaceships. It also introduces what we would today call the staple of the History Channel, the ancient alien idea that aliens came to Earth and built the pyramids and took humans back to Mars. And so, during the course, they discovered that Martians have tried to invade the Earth before. The Sphinx, was built by ancient, people in Egypt worshiping the Martians as gods. Again, this idea that, aliens are actually the origin of a lot of our, gods from myths and legends across the Earth. That's something that Lovecraft, took very centrally. That's a key aspect of his worldview. There's an author, Jason Colavito, who's charted, how the idea, goes from Lovecraft to Eric von Daniken and Chariots of the Gods. And I mean, there's definitely a connect. It's not the only one. It's also that von Daniken and Lovecraft are reading a lot of the same materials also. But I mean, even von Daniken has to basically say oh, I didn't just copy Lovecraft. So there's other stuff he was appropriating also. During research for this book, it is interesting that I didn't really realize how much in science fiction magazines of the 20s and 30s, this is also a very common idea, the idea that Martians had come to Earth and that, in the distant past, and that's where ideas of Atlantis or the Egyptian gods, the Greek gods came from. So it is, again, kind of very interesting that this was a major pulp science fiction idea, but Lovecraft himself is very evocative of this. And again, in Edison's Conquest of Mars, Serviss uses the term cyclopean, meaning, giant. That becomes one of Lovecraft's favorite, adjectives, cyclopean. So it seems like maybe this is where he kind of first, reads that and starts using it as a model of his own fiction. Now, speaking of Lovecraft and aliens, we, in the news today, there's always, UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomenon. And Lovecraft was what we might call a UFO debunker before even the term UFO. UFOs are not new. I mean, they were called different things in the past, but in the 19th century, they're referred to as phantom airships or mystery airships. These are very common from really the 1870s on, or even before then, you hear stories of phantom balloon sightings. And so again, especially in the 1890s, there's a huge wave of sightings of these phantom airships. Typically, they're attributed to, American inventors. I mean, Garrett Serviss writes about Edison's conquest of Mars. He's explicitly basing this on the idea that all of these mystery airships are the work of Edison or inventors like him. But a number of these do claim that these airships are Martian ships coming to Earth. You have stories, like Martian airships landing in the middle of Texas, trying, to kidnap someone and bring them back into their ship. Martians landing and dissecting cows. You get the early cattle mutilations. Famously in the town of Aurora, Texas, there's basically almost exactly 50 years before Roswell, the story about this alien ship crashing, the townspeople burying the dead alien in the town cemetery, the U.S. Army showing up, to clear everything away. So again, these ideas aren't new, but they pop up every few years. In December of 1909, just as that earlier wave of the 1890s was in the West Coast, the South, there's a new wave that happens in the Northeast, specifically kind of around Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, and very quickly, this mystery airship that's being spotted, a businessman named Wallace Tillinghast in Worcester claims that he's in his barn out back, he built this airship and he's been flying it around New England, and so everyone who's been seeing this strange light in the sky, that's actually his airship. And eventually it gets dismissed because they point out that this airship is being spotted while he's out drinking at a bar at the exact same time. So you think people would kind of well, anyway, so people are seeing this airship, and in December of 1910, actually Christmas Eve, Lovecraft is in downtown Providence. He's doing his Christmas shopping, and all of a sudden the crowd of shoppers in downtown Providence, they're all pointing up at the sky saying, look at that light in the sky, it's the Tillinghast airship flying overhead. And Lovecraft looks up and he says, this is the planet Venus. It's not a UFO, it's Venus. He writes into the Providence, Evening Journal. He keeps bringing this up again in his letters and his astronomy columns years later. So the misidentification of the mystery airship with the planet Venus, that's something that sticks to mind a lot. He does briefly mention once that he also saw people thinking, I think it was during World War I, they thought there was some German balloon over Providence, but it was just Mars that was rising. So again, this is something that, the misidentification of flying objects. Now, one of Lovecraft's recurring names he uses in his fiction is Tillinghast. It's probably not based on Wallace Tillinghast, the businessman, probably named after Pardon Tillinghast, who was one of the early settlers of Providence. But again, it is interesting that maybe this was the lingering notion of Wallace. Now, one of Lovecraft's other close collaborators, one of his friends, is a guy who lives in California named Clark Ashton Smith, who's a poet but also a writer on his own. Lovecraft, and Smith had this long correspondence, and in 1927, Smith mentions that in the 1890s, during that earlier airship wave, Smith sees what he calls a black meteor. He says this giant, a black cylinder that flies overhead silently. Again, today we would call this a UFO sighting. So Lovecraft calls it the black meteor, and again he says, that was probably just a cloud or something. He tries to dismiss it. But after Lovecraft dies in the 1950s, Smith sees another more traditional UFO also, or I guess flying saucer as they would have been called at the time. So again, Lovecraft is involved with debunking multiple UFO sightings. Just they weren't called UFOs at the time. But at the time that Smith sees his later flying saucer sighting in the 1950s, one of the leading proponents of UFOs that emerged was a man named Richard Shaver, who started writing supposedly nonfiction stories in the science fiction journal Amazing Stories about this race of aliens that live underground called the Darrows and fly up in their ships. And this becomes kind of one of the key early UFO mythologies. Shaver explicitly mentions Lovecraft as an influence, and he says, Lovecraft thought he was writing fiction. Actually, he was writing the truth. It was the aliens were sending stuff to his brain, and he was actually writing the reality of what alien life was like. So again, indirectly, even after his death, Lovecraft's fiction helped set the stage for the very earliest flying saucer stories of the 50s. It's also interesting because one of the other major proponents of flying saucers at the time was a retired Marine Corps pilot named Donald Kehoe. Kehoe published a lot of stories in the 1930s in Weird Tales. You can see this is one of his cover stories here. Weird Tales was the journal where the magazine where Lovecraft published most of his stories also. So you have the guy who would go on to become one of the main early UFO investigators in the 50s and 60s is writing fiction with Lovecraft. In some cases, they're publishing their stories in the same issue. They clearly did read each other's works, even though, again, Lovecraft wouldn't have really had anything stick out from Kehoe at the time. So again, you have this early intersection of Lovecraft and his legacy leading to modern UFOs. Again, kind of ironic for a guy who debunked UFO sightings whenever they came up. And speaking of the panic around the airships of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, another interesting panic in 1910 after the Tillinghast airship is debunked is the return of Halley's Comet. There are actually, again, the two comets in 1910. There's the Great January Comet, Halley's Comet later on. Lovecraft missed the Great January Comet because he had measles, so he couldn't, go out and see it. He did go out and see Halley's Comet. Again, this is his illustration of Halley's Comet on the left from Rehoboth, Massachusetts. He would ride his bike out there from Providence. Which, again, that's a fairly long bike ride, but he and his friends had like a little clubhouse there they would go to. So again, from Rehoboth, I think actually Horace and I identified where exactly. There's like a gas station there now. It's at some intersection in the middle of nowhere. But also, the return of Halley's Comet in 1910 came with it a major panic about, the Earth was going to pass through the tail of Halley's Comet, starting in 1874 with Comet Koja. A number of astronomers had determined with the use of the spectroscope that comets' tails contain traces of cyanogen. So there was an enormous panic in 1910 that because Halley's Comet's tail had cyanogen, it would kill all life on Earth. So you have this mass panic, people buying gas masks, people buying comet pills, which are really just, sugar pills to protect themselves from cyanogen. People are building, like comet shelters, like in their basement. There are stories, like people going into coal mines because they think the mine will protect them. My favorite one is I found an account of some guy built, underground, and he built this like kind of like elaborate bunker. Well, he said for free, he would offer people the chance to go into this bunker. He would seal it with concrete, and then he would be safe in there from the effects of the comet, poison. And then after 9 days, he would dig you out of it. I don't know how he thought he would live. And again, the thing is, this was a free service, but he would charge you for removing the concrete and letting you out of the bunker. So I don't know if anyone actually took that, but that was at least advertised. There are writings also that people killed themselves because they didn't want, and in some cases, they killed their families because they didn't want to die from the comet. So this was, a big panic, and obviously it didn't happen. It's probably most notable at the return of the comet. At the same time, Mark Twain dies, and because he had predicted he would die when Halley's Comet returned, because he had been born from its previous arrival, and also King Edward VII, I think, of England dies also. So you have these two major deaths that happen. Lovecraft never mentions the comet panic, so I guess it was something that I'm sure he did not take any stock in it, but again, something that is kind of interesting that was widespread at the time that he doesn't bring up. Something that he did write about that happens in the 1920s in terms of early, not quite astronomy, but we'll include it here because it involves spaces. The work of Robert Goddard, the founder of modern rocketry. Goddard's at Clark University in Worcester on March 16th, 1926. Goddard launches the world's first liquid-fueled rocket from the Asa Ward farm in Auburn, Massachusetts. The rocket flew a total of 184 feet, lands in a farmer's cabbage patch. Again, this is the start of modern rocketry. Goddard keeps working there for the next few years. The people get upset, his rockets keep landing in their farms. With the help of Charles Lindbergh, he gets a grant from the Guggenheim. He gets some money from the Smithsonian too, I think. He's able to relocate somewhere where he thinks, nothing of interest is ever going to happen. So he takes his rockets and he moves to Roswell, New Mexico. So again, kind of an interesting, but he dies in 1945, so that's 2 years before, the flying saucer crash in Roswell. But again, kind of interesting, what Goddard might have thought. I mean, probably wouldn't have thought much because actually in 1947, Roswell was not really a big thing. It's only decades later that it becomes what it is today. But kind of funny that the creator of the modern rocket then goes on to relocate to Roswell. I'll mention also another kind of interesting fact about Goddard. One of his students at Clark University was a guy named Edwin Aldrin, whose son would become Buzz Aldrin. So again, he has that interesting connection there too. Lovecraft is very interested, in Goddard. I did find in the lab library, Goddard publishes in 1919 a pamphlet, I think it was called like A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitude by Rocket, which is basically laying out the idea that you can build a large liquid-fueled rocket, and that if you make it in stages, it could hypothetically reach the moon. Ladd did get a copy of this, but this is after Lovecraft kind of stopped visiting Ladd, so he probably didn't read it. But the New York Times does, take note of this, and they write this, really mocking editorial about Robert Goddard, where they talk about how obviously, because space is a vacuum, there's nothing for a rocket to react against, and so rockets obviously can't function in space. And they retract this, in I think it's the day after Apollo 11 lands on the moon. So a famous retraction later on. That's the kind of like a popular misunderstanding of science that Lovecraft definitely, would have noted and been very critical of. But Lovecraft, does specifically say he keeps in, abreast of Goddard's research. He writes, he has this letter here where he's talking to his friends about the idea of a trans-Neptunian planet, communicating with Venusians and Martians, and what seems to be a reference to Goddard's paper, the Goddard Plan for sending a rocket to the moon. Kenneth Sterling, who is one of his young neighbors in Providence, who he co-writes a story with. He talks about respecting Goddard as an investigator. And then notably, The Color Out of Space, which is Lovecraft's favorite short story. Got turned into a movie a few years ago. It's about a meteorite crashing in a farm in central Massachusetts, releasing, some kind of alien effect that starts mutating the farm. At the end, the alien color shoots back up into space. It says here, without warning, the hideous thing shot vertically up towards the sky like a rocket. This is the only reference to a rocket in any of Lovecraft's fiction. Again, this is central Massachusetts, a farm there, just like where Goddard's rockets are falling into farms in central Massachusetts. He wrote this, right after Goddard was doing his first rocket launches. So I think maybe Lovecraft's own personal favorite story has some of that influence of Goddard's research on it. So to start winding down, I'm going to focus on Lovecraft and 2 planets in particular and his interest in them. So I mentioned Kenneth Sterling here, who actually years later, he would go on to become a very well-known surgeon. I think he did some kind of work on some kind of implant for your body, but he became a very well-known surgeon later in life. But as a teenager, he wrote pulp stories for science fiction. He wrote a very early parody story, I think called The Brain Eaters of Pluto or something. But he lived next to Lovecraft in Providence, by coincidence. He's the guy who writes all the stories. He lives down the street from me. So he and Lovecraft became friends, and they co-wrote one story together. This is 1936, In the Walls of Eryx, which is very unique for Lovecraft in that it's a straight space opera. There's no cosmic mystical forces. It's not set on Earth. Most of Lovecraft's stories are set in Massachusetts. This one is about a swampy Venus, as the conception was, and it's about human colonists going to Venus, hunting down these energy crystals to bring back to Earth, and running across what are called the man lizards, which are the native life of Venus, which you see here. Later, people say, this is very similar to the plot of Avatar, essentially. I mean, I don't think James Cameron probably didn't read this, but again, there's a general like similar theme there. But again, less well known than his work on Martian canals, Percival Lowell was also very interested in promoting the idea of life on Venus. He argued that there were, these spokes on Venus you could view, which has never really been fully explained what Percival Lowell was seeing. But in his nonfiction articles on Venus, Lovecraft talks about the Lowell spokes and supports it. Lovecraft writes he always thought that life on Venus was more likely than life on Mars. And again, this is because Lovecraft is embracing the nebular hypothesis of a solar system development, the idea that the solar nebula condensed from the outside in. So outer planets are older than younger planets. So just like Mars is dying, Mars is what Earth is about to become or will become in the future. Venus is like Earth in the past. And so based on this idea, Lovecraft writes about a Venus that's very swampy, covered in this dinosaur-like life. Again, very atypical for his stories, but maybe a sign of what his fiction might have become more like had he lived longer. I'll say also, Lovecraft had a number of interesting kind of like young teenage science fiction fans near the end of his life, including a young man named L. Ron Hubbard. So again, that's kind of an interesting way in which, there might have been some longer lasting connection there had Lovecraft lived longer. They actually met each other in person too. So the other planet I'll mention is the planet Pluto. I mentioned that, his novel, The Whisperer in Darkness, is about the alien Migo who come from a planet called Yuggoth. During the time that Lovecraft is writing The Whisperer in Darkness, like halfway through writing it, Pluto is discovered. And so as a result, Lovecraft basically at the end of The Whisperer in Darkness, he writes like, oh, Yuggoth, that's actually what we call Pluto. He ends with like the idea that Clyde Tombag discovers Pluto because the Migo have like sent psychic signals to him to identify Pluto. Interestingly enough, Tombag himself will later write that like he felt like very drawn just to observe this one section of the sky, and so it kind of actually fits with what he was writing. Tombag also would later see a flying saucer. So again, you can see maybe the aliens are coming, to check up on him. And interesting though, in 2015, the New Horizons probe goes past Pluto. One of the regions that's identified is initially called, again, Cthulhu Regio there. It gets renamed Cthulhu Macula. And then unfortunately last year it's formally renamed Belton Regio. So it's no longer has that Lovecraft connection, but at least for 8 years, Cthulhu was on Pluto. However, there is still, speaking of New Horizons, kind of the counterpart probe Messenger, which goes by Mercury. One of the craters it discovers is called Lovecraft. So there is still a Lovecraft crater on Mercury. So that being said, I'll finish up soon, but just to bring things back here to the skyscrapers. I mentioned Lovecraft dies in March of 1937. When he dies, he's very famous for writing extremely long letters. I mean, I think the longest letter he wrote was like 90 pages long, just to one of his friends. And actually, Lovecraft is the most prolific letter writer in the English language. The only, of any language, the only more prolific letter writer is Voltaire. So Lovecraft wrote around 100,000 letters that we know of in his life. So again, just give you an example, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote around 500 letters we have. So this is magnitudes longer. So you guys get a good deal of Lovecraft's life. But one of the very last letters he wrote that he didn't even send because he died partway through writing it is to his friend James F. Morton. But it's about the skyscraper. So he says, October 9th, 1936, I attended a meeting of the local organization of amateur astronomers, the skyscrapers. Again, don't read the whole thing out there. It's up there for you to read if you want. But again, he talks about he went to a meeting. He talks about the society had recently purchased a well-known private observatory of the late F.E. Seagrave with an 8-inch refracting telescope. He talks about all this. He talks about at the meeting, there was an address on early Rhode Island astronomy. The reflecting telescope of Joseph Brown, used to observe the transit of Venus, was exhibited. Again, this means that one of the very last things Lovecraft wrote before he died was about the skyscrapers. One of the reasons Lovecraft attended that meeting, Lovecraft had a friend right here in North Scituate named Charles A. Mowry. Mowry formerly joined the skyscrapers when it was incorporated in November 1936. But I looked and he does make appearances throughout the history of the skyscrapers in the 30s. I think through the 50s he shows up. I think he was a big variable star observer. I think that was his main interest. So again, Lovecraft had this friend who was behind one of the major early skyscrapers. Apparently, Mowry talked about Lovecraft to a lot of the other friends, but this is something also where a lot of what Mowry talked about, this is kind of like an oral history that never really got written down. But I think a couple of years ago, someone kind of wrote down what Mowry's friend in turn told him. So we have kind of like, I guess, second or third hand accounts. But these are accounts of this guy who was interested in astronomy, talking with Lovecraft about his interest in astronomy that we don't really have any other source for. So we're kind of lucky that that chain of transmission did happen. And then kind of appropriately enough, a final connection here. So in 1933, Lovecraft and his aunt, they lived together. Lovecraft's divorced by that point. His aunt is a widower. They're the last members of their family left. So they live together. They're looking for a new place to live in Providence. They almost move into Frank Seagrave's old house on Benefit Street. So they eventually don't, but again, they came very close to Lovecraft, living, and he means he would have, died in Seagrave's house if he had moved there. So again, I thought that would be, an appropriate end given where we are now. So again, I'll just put this up here. If you want to email, again, that's my email at the top. That's Horace's email beneath. You can buy. Again, I have 5 copies here. Happy to sell them at a discount, and I'll sign them for you for sure. If I run out, or if you want to buy it later, you can buy it directly from Hippocampus Press. It is available on Amazon also. If you go to Lovecraft Arts and Science at the Providence Arcade on Waybosset Street, you'll be able to find physical copies there. Probably the only place in the world you can actually find this book on the shelf, so that's pretty fun to know too. And so again, happy to answer any questions. Yes.
In your research, have you uncovered any direct contact between Seagrave and Lovecraft?
No, we weren't able to find any sign that they had a communication with each other. I forget the guy who did who knew Mowry's friend is kind of writing that third-hand account. Again, he seems to indicate Lovecraft and Seagrave never knew each other, and Lovecraft never mentioned it. And again, some of those things where we can't know 100% for sure, but Lovecraft talks about other astronomers he meets, so he probably would have written about
I
this.
think your last, well, a letter he wrote kind of indicates that he didn't meet him.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, from what we can tell, almost certainly they
Because-
party.
In that January meeting at Sales in the Hall, Upton does introduce Lowell to Lovecraft.
Mhm.
Based on what only a very small tidbit of the research that I've done on, Seagrave may have been in attendance to that, because he makes reference to it later on that Lowell mentioned something to him about the canals or something, but it's only like a few words. So I thought those two had met, and I just don't know why he wouldn't have met Lovecraft,
It's definitely it is possible that they were there, and that if Lovecraft knew of Seagrave, that he may have been too shy to kind of bring himself to introduce him.
There's about 40 years between them.
Yeah, I mean, and really the only reason Lovecraft probably went to Percival Lowell was because Upton was there to introduce him.
Right.
There's other cases, Lovecraft meeting people he likes and just being too shy to introduce. So that also may have been a factor too.
Yeah, it's only 7.
Yeah, he would have been 17 or even I think 16 technically at the
Yeah.
time. So yeah.
That's kind of.
Kathy,
Good question. I was in college, I remember writing a paper on the relationship between Moby Dick and Lovecraft's writings. And I had visited a friend of a friend, and he gave me all of Lovecraft's books, and probably about 12 of them. And you didn't mention any connection. There are some sources that say that Moby Dick influenced some of Lovecraft's writing, and then, but he obviously read it because it was his own copies in some archive. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and I do know that Lovecraft, did own Moby Dick, and that actually was kind of rare. Like Moby Dick wasn't really as in high esteem then as it was now, so it is kind of interesting that he did own Moby Dick. I know there's been at least some writing since then on the connection. I can't really speak a whole lot more to that, but yeah, again, there have been some people who wrote it. I think actually there may have been a talk at one of the recent Necronomicons on Moby Dick, and so there probably, I'll say there certainly is at least one article out there somewhere about it, but off the top of my head, I can't really unfortunately can't say any more. Yeah.
You didn't mention anything about Lovecraft doing any actual observing with his telescope.
Yeah, he did. I think it was a 3-inch refractor, if I'm remembering right, that he owned, and he did use that a lot in his in his teenage years. I think after his teenage years, I don't know if there's any sign that he did any actual observing, but certainly during his time. Again, I'll go back to his early. Yeah, again, like for example, this map of Mars here, he did this through his personal telescope, the Saturn. Well, in any case, yeah, right here, the image of Saturn and Jupiter here. This is based on the observing he did with his telescope. He was very interested in observing the moon. Again, speaking of Pickering, I mentioned Pickering. Pickering had the idea of vegetation growing on the moon, and there was a period where Lovecraft was very dedicated to proving the idea that you could observe changes on the moon's surface. So he spent a lot of time observing the moon with his telescope. Interesting. Lovecraft's telescope, I think, does still exist. If I'm remembering right, it's in Wisconsin with either the
Derleth Society.
yeah, I forgot if it was either the Derleth Society or the State or Historical Society of Wisconsin. I think it's the Derleth Society. Again, for those who aren't aware, it's August Derleth is kind of a complicated figure who was one of the people who kind of like took over Lovecraft's estate without any real legal grounds to do so, and kind of like portrayed himself as the guardian of Lovecraft, and with mixed results, we'll say. But he seems to have somehow, I think he visited Providence several months after Lovecraft died, and again made off with a number of Lovecraft's effects, which may or may not have been legal or had any grounds. So like a couple people kind of like went and pilfered some of Lovecraft's stuff as soon as he died. By all accounts, his aunt was kind of happy just to get it all out of the house.
Did they ever write anything together?
They never wrote anything together, but after Lovecraft died, August Derleth took some of Lovecraft had like a notebook of like ideas, and Derleth would like spin off some of those ideas into full-length books, but he explicitly said this was a posthumous collaboration between them. So he would portray it as co-written by August Derleth and H.P. Lovecraft, and it was like Lovecraft would have written like 100 words out of the total, and Derleth would have written 30,000, and so that's the extent of the collaboration between them. And again, one of the things is Lovecraft did collaborate with other of his friends during his lifetime. I think Derleth was probably kind of upset at the idea that Lovecraft never collaborated with him during his life. But again, Derleth is a whole giant sensitive issue, so that could be its whole talk. Not much to do with astronomy, but it's his own talk.
I'm going to have to ask you, thank you very much.